Thank you, Dr. Kresge, and also thank you again to Dr. Levy. We now have some time for our Q&A. We have essentially 4 questions in our Q&A, and it's unclear who it should go to, so I guess you can decide who wants to take it. And let me just say that some of these questions are broad and some are very specific. So let me start with how would data privacy regulations, for example, what is present in the EU, affect the collection of all this worker data? And it sounds like, Dr. Kresge, that's probably something you could handle here.
Yes, before I should clarify, I haven't received my PhD yet, so.
Oh, okay. All right.
Should clarify that it's a master's degree, but the GDPR in Europe, the Data Privacy Act and the General Data Privacy Act, and we're also looking at this in terms of CCPA, so the California Consumer Privacy Act, how that's going to play out. This is something that Matt Scher will speak about tomorrow, but these data privacy laws do enable notification and disclosure of the data collection, as well as how that data is being used. And really, workers were just included in the CCPA starting on January 1st, and I'm not going to get into the details. I think Matt will talk about that tomorrow. But we're really just starting to look at what that looks like. We don't necessarily know the extent to which that data will have meaningful impacts on these technologies. And enforcement doesn't take place until July. So we're going to see sort of a patchwork rollout of what that looks like for workers.
Great. Let me also ask another question about basically how these algorithms are developed. And this could be answered by either of you. And that is, what happens when the context changes after an algorithm is developed or in the process of developing it, in terms of the ultimate result for the development of that algorithm, namely a set of metrics. Like, is there any regulation, or is there any mechanism for revising algorithms as a function of the contextual situation on which the algorithm was developed? So, Dr. Levy, would you like to start with that, perhaps?
Sure, I can speak to that, although I think, Lisa, your talk was just phenomenal, and I'm so excited about reading the full report. So I'm sure you can speak to this too. I can say, based on some other work I've done that I didn't describe today, like certainly, one of the virtues of algorithmic systems is that they can learn from new inputs, right? They can be retrained. But those, to Lisa's point, I think about context, that assumes a degree of resource availability that may or may not be present. So in public sector context, for example, right, like procurement processes may enable a city agency, for example, to procure an algorithm. But if you don't also have, both money and expertise and new data to retrain an algorithm given a new set of social contexts, like that algorithm can basically go stale. And I think we saw this quite acutely in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, right? Where suddenly our predictions about lots of different things in criminal justice and education and resource allocation and all kinds of different domains, like didn't hold so much for the context in which we were then existing. And so people recognize that as kind of a breach in the normal course of operations. But sometimes things aren't that acute, right? It's just that things change more slowly or more gradually, and we don't always recognize that when we're deploying these predictive systems.
Ms. Kresge, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I think that covered the context question well.
Great, great answer. So is it fair to say that social homogeneity might be a euphemism for or suggestive of a lack of diversity due to, in part, to racism, sexism, and other systemic issues? And I'm assuming this has to do with the development of algorithms.
That is, I'll take that since I I mentioned that in my presentation. That is a common criticism of these systems, and the development of these systems is sort of the blind spots that are held by predominantly white male culture that is in the tech industry, and we've seen lots of challenges in terms of diversity in the tech industry. This is a long-term discussion. There are books written about the decline of diversity of the industry over the last several decades. So that is one argument about the blind spots essentially in the design and the effects. In the particular context of low-wage work, we see technologies that are developed by people who have never had those jobs before and don't really understand what the implications of the design decisions that they have developed those systems with mean for a worker on the front line. And so that is really, that's another piece of the social homogeneity. If you have a PhD in computer science, you may or may not have ever worked on the floor of a warehouse. So that might limit your understanding about what that actually feels like or looks like in the real world.
And I'm assuming that the same response would be in response to different cultures responding to these algorithmic failures. So is there anything else you would like to add to that with respect to different cultures?
In terms of the interpretation of the technology, or?
I think the question really revolves around, so would there be some cultures more open to algorithms than other cultures? For example, with selection systems where people are more accepting of selection apps than other cultures.
I can speak to maybe a related question, which is just about kind of the differential impacts that these workplace surveillance systems can have on different people. It's not exactly what the question asked, but I think it's close enough. So one thing to note, of course, is that, certainly people who are differentially marginalized in society often bear the brunt of these technologies in some ways that Lisa explained already, whether that's discrimination in hiring processes. There's a really wonderful book by an oral historian named Anne Belay, who writes about the specific challenges that in trucking that queer and trans drivers face, including it's difficult for people to go into truck stops to use the restroom. So they tend to bring kind of portable restrooms to use in the cab. If you have a camera system in the cab, that makes it that much more difficult to use those systems. So that certainly, I think, is something that we should always keep our eye on, is the way in which these systems can have either differential accuracy if we're looking at an AI-driven system, or even if it's just data collection, how that can affect people in very different ways.
So I have a broader question here, which has to do with how tasks are designed and time allocations are assigned to tasks. And of course, this has a lot to do with warehouse work and other forms of production. We know that industrial engineers set up the sequence of tasks and the time allocations identified for each of those. How do we ensure that that system, which then becomes automated and tracked through a set of metrics, is actually right to begin with, and it stops short of harming people by performing that work in that particular way? And this question for either of you.
Karen, do you want to touch on that?
Go for it. I feel like that's a bit closer to your talk.
Right. Well, I think that this is going to touch on this. These systems are designed with constraints, right? So you can put constraints on what the system looks like. So one of the insights about collective bargaining is that even in situations where the provisions are not focused specifically on a technology, but in the example of scheduling systems, there are all of these work rules that dictate how scheduling is done. So that is a very different, those are different rules for the nursing industry, different rules for the retail industry. And so those rules become embedded through hard programming into those systems, basically constraining what that looks like. So you can, even though the systems are learning, etc., you can hard code the constraints on what that system does.